We're now going to set out the jowl post, which gives us the height of the building, and this is a single story building, and with the use of the rod, or we can use the dividers, we can then set out the height, and where the jowl post fits into the tie beam, we're going to set out the joints so that the jowl post will fit into the tie beam with the necessary mortises to go into the wall plate and to go into the tie beam. So the first thing we need to do is to set out the wall plate. And the wall plate, as we know, we have the top of it here, so we need to allow that offset when we set out the top of the jowl post. And the jowl post is called a jowl post because the width of the post widens at the top to give more strength to the joint where the tie beam sits on the wall plate, and it anchors it all together. This joint holds the whole building together, and with the dovetail also into the wall plate gives a further anchoring. So we're going to set out the jowl, we're going to set out the height, and we're going to set out the joint. When we set out the height, we also include the setting out of the sole plate, which is the plate that runs along the bottom of the building, which supports the posts, supports the studs, which then supports the wall plate. Right, we're going to start and set out the wall plate. So we're going to run parallel. As you can see, we have made sure that the back of the post is flush with the wall plate. So when it sits up, the whole side of the building will be flush, especially if the building is going to be clad with tiles or weatherboarding. It's going to have a nice, neat finish. And it's a plane where all frames are set out on a good face.
Here is that distance, just to allow.
Yeah, this is back here. I'll come back.
Even more?
Yeah, there.
So that's the top of the wall plate?
Yeah. Yep. So we then need to come down the depth of the wall plate. We've now decided where the top of the wall plate is going to be. We then need to come down. This is a ruler, which is the actual unit of the rod, and it's also the distance we have on the dividers, and we've then divided that into eighths, and we're using it to set out the joints. This is a decision that I've done. Whether the medieval carpenters did the same, it could be quite likely. Other people think that maybe they set out joints and timber sizes by the distance of the thumb to their middle finger, or mortises the length of the thumb. It could be this, that could be the case, but this seems to be more valid. So the actual depth of the wall plate is 5 units, 5/16ths of a unit, and we're calling it 5. Oh, can't do that, can we? Oh, yeah, it can. Yeah.
Okay.
So we got the depth of the wall plate. Now we're talking about this timber.
Yeah, maybe what needs to be mentioned is that we made sure
We make sure.
sure that is
Yeah.
the 5 units.
Yeah. And then we would plumb down on the sides, or square down.
My right from
Mm-hmm.
the camera.
And then the width.
Width which is
check. Just 5, yeah, that's 5.
exactly that.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Nice, really. That's straight.
Yeah.
It's lovely.
Is that okay, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, could do everything with that.
Yeah. So if we just, for the benefit of the camera, we bold that up so you can see those lines. There's the wall plate, which is this. We know that it's set into the tie beam, so we need to come down to get the distance from there, which would sit underneath the wall, the tie beam. So we need to find out what that offset is.
So that one you put 3,
35.
35. It's a bit more even. Sort of 36.
No, you just need that point, then we scribe, yeah?
Ah, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
You do
So
that.
then you'd use compasses, and then you check that distance, and then you set your compasses to make sure that's the right point. Then this could be variable. You then set your compasses to there, and you go down to there.
So like scribe it, yeah?
Scribing, yeah. Which we have.
Oh.
And these are dividers, not necessarily compasses, but they can be confused. A compass would maybe hold a pencil or a graphite marker.
Okay.
Dividers are fixed points.
Okay. So what you're saying is
Yeah.
that you take this distance.
Yeah.
You would make sure that's parallel.
Yeah, it is.
So it is, yeah.
Which it would be, wouldn't it? But this one might be different. We need to scribe that now. You need to set from there to there.
Here to here, okay.
Yeah.
And then scribe along.
Yeah.
Okay, I understand. Yeah.
Then scribe down.
So a point there.
Well, I would go all the way down, yeah?
Ah, you would just scribe it on. Oh.
You might as well, mightn't you?
Oh, definitely. Okay. Yeah.
If it's there, you might as well do it.
Yeah, of course. Beautiful.
That then becomes where the jowl post sits underneath the tie beam. If I pencil that in, it should show up clearly. Oops, didn't do that very well, did I? There. So that timber will fit into there, and this will then become the wall plate. And now we need to set out a joint. Now this wall plate will sit on a tenon on the jowl post. So we will then divide that up into 3 and set out a tenon for the wall plate. So we can use again 3 5s 15, aren't they? Roughly.
Yeah, it is 15 nearly.
So we do parallel on that. That becomes our tenon.
So that's the width of your tenon?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So is that a way you found out a lot on medieval building? It would be a third of
Quite
the size
often.
of the timber. Okay.
Quite often I come across it, yeah. Especially when I do repairs and I have to take them apart.
Yeah.
And you've got to measure them and fit. Say you've got to fit a new jowl post into an
Yeah.
existing tie beam.
You need to measure
Your
the
tenon's got to
thickness.
fit. And this is where you quite often check the size of the tenon.
Yeah.
But normally it usually goes in halfway. Maybe,
Halfway in the wall plate, you mean?
Yeah.
So So that's going to be a half. So 70.
Yeah, so you
Well,
mortise
We could even.
go to there on the tenon.
You want to be there?
Yeah, and you'd sink the mortise to
Yeah,
there.
way deeper. Okay.
Yeah. We've now set out the tenon, which will then go in underside, which will go in the underside of the wall plate. Naturally, you must allow, you cut short, and so you can scribe in, make sure it all fits. But this will be your line you'll be scribing to. Then on the inside of the jowl post, we put a teasel tenon. And a teasel tenon will go into the tie beam. We've just set out the tenon to go into the wall plate, which will have a peg hole here somewhere. This time we're going to put a tenon that will go into the tie beam, and there will be a peg somewhere here, which will then secure it. So before we do that, we make sure we set out the width of the jowl post, and we use our unit, which is usually, very commonly, 1 unit of the rod. We also, because it tapers down to give us this extra width so we can have a tenon in it, we will go down 3 units from the top of the tie beam, from the top of the wall plate, sorry. 1, 2, 3. That will be
Like that.
yeah.
Do you want to ping it?
Yeah, can do. Yeah. Yeah. That's
Oh yeah. Okay.
let's get a parallel line in there.
Just to confirm. Okay.
We've now, this is the bottom of the jowl we've fixed. We've measured it 3 units from the top of the wall plate, and we're going to flick a line from there to there, and then that will give us the measurement for the jowl. Okay,
Even to the top.
lovely. And there's the line, and this will be waste, that'll be removed. And then now we have a width for the tenon to go into the tie beam. Quite often it's the full width of the jowl, but quite sometimes it's shorter. It just varies. Sometimes the mortise is preferably not to go right next to your dovetail joint, so sometimes they come in, sometimes the full width, and it doesn't really matter. So we just need to draw a parallel on that.
Is that long enough?
Can't do it.
Nearly there.
Oh yes, we can. Then oops. So then that will become a tenon, and it would have a hole in it, and it will be 1/3 of the jowl post, and this would be set out accordingly, and then you would sink in a mortise, and this will become a tenon. So what we want to do is take that line
Yep.
straight across, and that will give you,
Where the mortise
that would be
goes.
plumbed down to be the back of the mortise. So we now set out the jowl post.
Brilliant.
So that would be the tenon, which will go into the underside of the wall plate, and we then set out the height of the building. We can use this and we could paste it down there, or we could use the rod as we've been using the rod on the rest of the building. And it wants to be 9 units. From the top of the wall plate to the underside of the sole plate is 9.
9, yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
You square that across. Yep. You mark the bottom. This is waist. We then come up the depth of the sole plate, which we don't have. It's very likely and very common it'd be the same size as the wall plate. So the sole plate would be 5, yeah? So that will be a shoulder. You plumb down there. And down there.
And then that's the catching.
And then you'd set out a tenon. So when this is raised up, it will go into a mortise into the sole plate
So the tenon is going to be
in there. So correction, the tenon will be set out on this face here, and it will be set out onto the sole plate. So we could set the tenon out on there.
So thirds as well?
Yeah, why not? Just for the exercise.
Yeah.
Yep. So now to recap, we've now completed setting out the jowl post, and I will go through just to recap on the process of doing it. So you would have a sole plate, you'd cut a tenon, and then the sole plate would have a hole, a peg hole, which will then secure the base of the jowl post. We have measured the height of the building, which comes to the top of the wall plate. We've then set out a tenon to go into the underside of the wall plate. We've also set out a teasel tenon to go into the jowl post. The whole process would be repeated on the other jowl post, which is in position there, and we've also set out the actual jowl, which we've got waist to come out, we have tenons to make, we've got waist, we've got tenons, we've got waist, and we've got tenons. That's the completion of the jowl post. Before we move the timbers out the way, ready to set out the wall plates, the tie beam looks a bit untidy at the moment because it's going to be trimmed to these lines here to make it much neater, so you won't see this is all going to be waste, just because you might think what a very untidy tie beam, but it's going to be tidied up and probably chamfered, and maybe the crown post might be chamfered, and it could look that is decoration, and decoration is very common in halls where it's open, the roof. you would have a decorative crown post, like I said before, and the tie beam may be decorative, could have a moulding on it, a chamfer. So that all that decoration would be done before on the framing floor, while it's in a position where it can be decorated. So we're now going to dismantle all this, and we're going to set out the wall plates. Okay, we continue now. We're going to set out the wall plates, and these two timbers down here, as I said before, are the wall plates which will be supporting the rafters and the tie beams. And below the wall plates you would have the sole plates which sit above the ground. They're the same length and the same dimensions. So if we set out one wall plate, we'd be able to copy it for the other wall plate. Not only that, we'd be able to plumb down and put the same measurements onto the sole plates. So in setting out one wall plate, we can set out 3 timbers accordingly. So all we need to do is accurately set out one wall plate, which is what we're going to demonstrate now. Now, we could measure it out again using the dividers, but we will stick with the rod as we've been setting out everything with the rod. This is quite important, just in case maybe someone knocked the dividers and moved them out of adjustment, and then they could throw you during your setting out. So we're going to start with the main wall plate, and there would be another wall plate which would be going across at the ends of the buildings, and this is we can check with the rod, so we know they're in the right place, and we can then run down here. So we know that dimension, we've got it here, and now we're going to set out the length of the building.
All right.
And we set out the posts, and there would be there'll be 2 tie beams across this building here. There'll be a post underneath each tie beam and a post in the corner, and the end wall plates will be the same width as these, and that wall plate across there will be the same width, but as we know the tie beams are slightly wider, so when we set out the walls we set out as centres only. So if the posts vary, then it doesn't matter because we're working to a centre line. So we put in 2 measurements at the moment, which represents the wall plate going across the building, and I'll emphasise this joint so it's clearly seen. And that will be plumbed down. And then the joint would be either a tenon going in the side of the wall plate, or it could be a halving, or it could be a dovetail dropping in. So that is the choice of the carpenter framing up. I'm just describing the setting out. From the setting out of the end wall plate, we go down 8 units, 6, 7, 8. And then either side we go 3.5. And then we go 8. and that is the wall plate. On that end we have tie beam and another tie beam and a wall plate. Then from that centre line and from this centre line they would be carried on down to the sole plates, and that would be the position for the jowl post which we set out earlier on. And then these can be transferred onto the sole plates so everything will line up. And then on top of the tie beam, if we move this, we will then set out the joints for the dovetails on the tie beam, and these can be of any configuration. It can vary. And it's usually the craftsman setting out the building or setting out his joint will decide how he wants to set out the dovetail, and this will go down to the depth which we had on our tie beam, and then that will be mortised down to the same depth, and that would be cut out. Also, on the other side there would be the tenon for the top of the jowl post, and then that would be set out on the reverse side. So you repeat that here where the other jowl post is going to be, and then the joint on the wall plate will either be a halving joint or it could be a mortise joint. All I'm doing is setting out the actual positions of the timbers, the tie beams, using the centre line, and also the jowl post which will be coming in underside. So once we've set out the tie beams, we can now set out the rafters. The next stage, once we've set out the tie beams and we set out the end wall plates, we now can set out the centres for the rafters. And we're using every 2 units will be the centre of a rafter, so we mark that from the rod. All the way down, and the centre of that rafter is exactly in the centre of the tie beam, so that will then match the rafter on the tie beam, and then we carry on going down the wall plate. Now, when I've been checking the plans of medieval buildings, these dimensions always appear to work. So wherever you get the centres of the jowl posts, they always work out exactly to the units of the rod, which means then the rafters will always work on the units, the same units. So while Victor's going down marking the rafters, I'm marking out the trenches which would be chopped out to take the feet of the rafters, and they would just sit in a trench on top of the wall plate. The actual weight of the rafters and the timbers will just keep it in there. Sometimes I've seen that a peg is driven in on the angle from the top of the rafter into the wall plate to secure it, but not always. Maybe every other rafter or even the centre rafter is just temporarily fixed as an extra precaution. So that continues down all the way down the wall plate. Then we got the tie beam, and they're the equal spaced, and there'll be one on the end, and then in between the wall plates you would again continue with the trenches as it goes down the wall plate. If this roof has got a hip on it, usually then the hip would be controlled by the tie beam. These would then become jack rafters, and then you'd have a hip gable probably on the tie beam as an alternative end. So it'd either have a gable end, then this setting out would be correct and this would become a gable, or it could become a hip. So the setting out wouldn't change. And then in between the tie beams, the setting out continues. Like that, all the way down till you finish down there. And these will then become the trenches for the rafters. Then if that tie beam then is rolled out, this wall plate is rolled over, and you can set out then the studs to go underneath, and they would be spaced for window openings, door openings, whatever's required. So everything, once that has been set out on the top of the wall plate and you set out studs on the underside, they can be transferred onto sole plates below. So this finishes the setting out of the building. As straightforward as that. And hope you can understand how it can be simply done without a tape measure, without any geometry, right down to setting out the rafters, door frames, window frames.